Thanks for joining me today. This was going to be fun plus interesting plus, maybe even a little controversial. So I'm looking forward to it. It's identity and social media.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It is definitely an emerging conversation, and I think one that's going to be met with a lot of debate in the public and private sector over time.
I agree with you, but let me start with a data point. Kind of not a data point, it's an anecdote. So this was in our Future of Identity report, focused on social media. And we talked about the fact that TikTok is now going to collect biometric identifiers and other information from users to verify and validate their identity. What do you make of that? And is that TikTok being sort of ahead of the curve, or is that now going to be table stakes in your view, or should it be?
I believe we need to break that question into a couple of pieces, Karen, and I'll tell you why. Because I do believe there's a conversation to be had around how do we make sure that individuals, and particularly influencers who have millions of followers, are actually credentialed to speak on certain topics, particularly when those topics may influence health outcomes or may influence choices people make and where they show up and what they believe. And you're a journalist, and I actually heard the other day that like 57% of millennials get all of, I think it was in our study, get all of their data and their news from social media. And so you can start to ask yourself, in the world where you and I grew up and where journalism was very, very accredited and it came published on the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, landing in front of your doorstep every day, there was a trust factor, and it was anchored in that these reporters were actually grounded in the knowledge that they needed in order to report on a certain subject. So one is there a conversation to be had around deeper evaluation and identity verification of individuals, within the social media platforms? And I think the answer is a resoundingly yes. And I don't think TikTok is not alone. The Indian government has recently said that anybody who wants to create an ID on social media has to be identified. You're seeing LinkedIn as well as Twitter that are starting to move into that space. Twitter specifically with automating the blue check mark that you have been credentialed and verified. So the answer is yes. I do believe it's on. The discussion around how you do that, Karen, I do think is a much deeper and controversial debate, whether it's a biometric identifier or it's some other piece of information that will represent with a high level of assurance that you are you. I think biometrics in general, as you know, is a bigger conversation to be had.
So what are we trying to do with that? And I agree that, people need to know who is on the other side of the tweet, the post, the dancing video, but it also becomes more relevant based on the content that individual is sharing. So there's one thing, which is who is that person? And then it's how do you recognize that person is in fact an authority on the topic? Because there are an awful lot of people, who could potentially get the check mark who really aren't the authority on the topic.
Well, that's the bigger problem. And that hasn't been solved yet. I do see a lot of organizations that are starting to play with this notion of a verifiable credential. That I went to Stanford or I went to Indiana University, that I'm the CEO of Authentics, that I am a thought leader in X space, just like you within the payment sector. And it's not something that has become mainstream. And I don't think there is one answer yet. But this idea of using technology, to your point, to not just verify, but to credential somebody and what they have the right or some level of certainty to be speaking about is on the horizon. Now, I think you and I are both recognizing that we're debating, freedom of speech on any topic, which is an amendment versus, telling somebody they can't talk about something, whether or not that they are of an authority figure. And that's where I believe the debate is going to lie. And it's maybe not the government who's going to form an opinion on that, but it is going to be some of these big platforms that are facilitating these huge dialogues that are having broader implications.
I think only though, if those platforms are told by the government that they're responsible for those posts. I mean, I think one of the complications here in the US is Section 230, which kind of immunizes these platforms from being responsible for the content that gets posted. So I think it becomes this is where I think it becomes a much more complicated discussion to have, because you can credential someone and that, I mean, I do think that that could become a deterrent. So if you are actually a person and you've been validated and verified as a person with a name and an identity, perhaps there is less likelihood that the content that you post will be damaging, harmful, false. But there's still, these platforms are not responsible unless they want to be responsible and take action for what gets posted.
Yeah, look, it's whether the government plays a role in creating the policies in which to have oversight on it, or the leaders of each one of these companies take a more active voice and making more controversial decisions like we saw in the last elections. Action will be taken somehow. And my challenge with this is, I do believe people should have a right to speech. I also believe that when you have millions of followers, you have a responsibility to report on facts and to share information where people can make sound decisions on. That being said, it's almost the responsibilities of the entities, the responsibilities of each of us to ensure that the actions we take aren't going to be harmful in any way. And that's why, while it's an emerging discussion, Karen, it has just gotten started. I think you and I would both agree with that. And the companies that we deal with that are customers of ours, what they are squarely focused on is removing fraud and keeping their customers safe. And that means a lot of different things. It's no longer about financial fraud. It is really about safety and misuse.
Yeah. Which I think is admirable. I like the direction. I hope we get more traction. I hope it becomes more than just a topic of conversation. You talked about validated credentials. Is there an analog to this in other sectors where validated credentials provide the access that we can all learn from, that these social platforms can learn from and perhaps borrow the best practices from?
I'd love to draw the analogy to payments. I'm at the end of the day, you're given a credential that effectively you can borrow money, and you can borrow money on a credit card or in some alternative form of lending. But it seems so obscure to what we're talking about right now. But to your point, it's about access, and it's about access to the right spaces and the right conversations and to the right areas of influence and communities. And so, I think a lot about what Hong Kong did years and years ago, which is you had one card, and that one card got you on transit. It got you to pay for goods and services in store, online. It got you access to your home. It got you access to the government spaces. And so there's some sort of credentialing behind there. But I do believe that this is a new analog that we're creating, candidly. And how do you rest assured that an employee is an employee of an entity, that an individual or a student went to the university that they claim to have gone to and gotten that degree? And then how do you do it where you're removing friction out of the process when you have to share that information? I mean, just a side note, I was asked for a verification from one of the banks, an employment verification for an employee of mine that was getting a new loan. And no joke, Karen, and I will not name the bank, it would be unfair to do that, but it was 3 weeks and 25 emails and repeatedly submitting the same information. And I thought to myself, I know this guy, I've known him for years. I know how much he's making. I know he's an employee. have the right to say that. And it still was, the process was completely broken.
Mm-hmm. But what was broken about it? Was it broken that they didn't believe that you were, the authenticated person to provide the information? What was broken about that experience?
Well, there are probably two major things for me, and it wasn't necessarily that I was the right person. It was more of, were the claims that he was making, where he worked, how much he made, how long he has been here, correct and factual? And how do you verify that claim? And in this financial institution specifically, they would send an encrypted email. You open up that encrypted email, you fill out the form. Well, then you don't fill out the form the exact way, and then your signature wasn't in the right place. Like all of these deterrents that really aren't necessary. Like I would have loved to have been able to say, here's a credential that's been verified by a third party, and what you're asking is all true, and that's all you need to know. Like, you don't have to get into all of the specifics, and it would have made this person's life easier versus being at risk of not getting the loan because the time horizon it took to do that, which I thought was really unfortunate. But it's a real life example of something we all deal with that can be eased with technology.
Yep, I agree. Well, can I switch gears just a little bit and talk about the notion of data portability? Because I think that's another area where, yes, we definitely, consumers want portability with respect to their data. I think about, healthcare data and the innovations with electronic health records that provide that portability for consumers. They can take their test results, they can take all of their medical history, and the interoperable nature of the electronic health record makes that possible. In banking and financial services, it's not so easy. And of course, as you know, the executive order that the president signed encourages, can't really stipulate or require, encourages that we move in that direction. So how does data portability and digital identity intersect if I'm a bank and I am being asked by a customer to have all of my banking records transferred? How? How do we do that without risk to the financial institution, without risk to the consumer? Like the social media example, it's something we need to address and recognize, but very complicated.
It is complicated. That being said, if you look to markets outside of the US, they've been addressing and tackling this for some time. So the equivalent open banking standards that were put in place in Australia a number of years ago that go beyond banking, actually. It goes, utility information and other types of data, private data. The EMEA has been doing it. Europe's been doing it for a while with PSD2, and this notion of how do you interoperate with other financial institutions and give the consumer choice. And so I think if this is the natural step, I personally was anticipating that something like this would be required or encouraged, as you said. But there are challenges with it. And I think we all know, you have to start from a position of, do you believe that consumers own the right to their own data? I personally believe they absolutely do. And I think those of us who've been around for a while, that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And so I kind of come from a world of, well, what if I could release my information to someone and get paid for using my data versus somebody else making the money using my information? And so I fundamentally believe we have to give consumers that choice. The portability offers complexity because now you're giving consumers more responsibility over an asset that they may not know what to do, how to store, and what that means by not doing it right. And so this gets into a conversation I think we had a couple of months ago around identity literacy, because you're absolutely right. Like, in order for banks to release information, just like healthcare providers to release healthcare information, you have to have a high level of assurance and certainty that that person is who they say they are.
Correct.
And that's where verification of who we are and what we do and how we behave has become paramount to the society we're living in right now.
But also this idea of validated credentialing and, the concept that we also talked about with the micro identities, when you're asking your financial institution to release all of your data, boy, the consumer has the right to ask. The consumer needs to understand the responsibility that goes along with making that request. Data accessibility, I think, is, obviously there are still the same identity authentication requirements for both the bank, the consumer, and the third party. But it's different when you're saying, here's your banking history for the last 20 years. See ya.
It absolutely is. I would say it's the same with your healthcare history. I mean, particularly as you and I did that piece on healthcare and identity, and Healthcare data is more valuable than financial data right now because of what you can do with it and how you can manipulate it. So I think we've got, I think we've got a tough road ahead of us, particularly as these things become the new normal. But I would argue that giving people the right not only to access, but to revoke access from others to their personal information is definitely the step forward. I would also argue that this notion of open banking and being able to port your financial information to other financial institutions has existed for a while. I mean, you've got Plaid and Yodlee and others that have created secure APIs in order to do that. And I kind of parallel it or draw an analogy to the telco sector when you used to not be able to port your phone number and all of your records, your ISP records. And granted, there's less risk with that. And then there became a time where if you wanted to move from AT&T to Verizon or somebody else, you could do that quite easily. And so we have to move forward, with that as, I think, the North Star, and to do it in a way where we're educating people along the way.
Do you think people actually move their telephone number from carrier to carrier? I actually
they used to.
I asked the question because I simply don't know. I simply don't know.
They used to, absolutely, all the time. Now, I mean, I think that the ISPs, they're so competitive rate wise, and I've had the same number for 20 years. But I mean, for my days at eBay and / PayPal, and I don't want to change it, but I will tell you that, the telecom providers have another challenge, and that is there's a lot of benefits that large institutions give or large company gives when you're part of, let's take Citi for an example. When I was at Citi, we got discounts on our phone bills. Well, Citi's kind of posed with this problem now. How do I know that some employees have left and some employees are still, the recipients of discounted phone bills? And I just use that as an example, having been privy to it. But there's a lot of enterprises that struggle with that, and so verification there becomes an important element as well. It's not just about who you are; it's about whether or not you're still employed.
Are you making a true confession, Carrie? Are you still part of that?
I don't take care of my phone bills. I gave it to my husband, so okay. I don't know.
All right, we won't tell anyone, but
no,
they're probably checking.
I don't know it's me.
They don't know. They don't know. Okay. All right. Well, we'll keep it our secret. All right. So
wait, how many followers do you have, Karen? You've got like tens of thousands of followers. No longer a secret. No.
I won't say anything. We'll redact that part of this conversation.
Thank you.
Okay. So social media, portability of banking and healthcare records. It has the common theme of being able to create an identity that can be verified, validated, and authenticated.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So how do we do that across the ecosystem of where identity is required to get the access? Sounds like that's what you're working on.
It is. I mean, this is what gets me up every day. And that's how do you participate in an ecosystem that has not really been yet defined? But the problem is felt. It becomes an economic problem as well as a safety problem. And it has implications on people's lives and on business entities. And, we're moving to a world where it's no longer just about the individual that you have to verify. It's about the business that you have to verify. It's about the employee you have to verify. Like there's so many other vectors to this that have ever been. And when I think about the magnitude of the problem, much like the payment sector, you got to start breaking it down. And it's what needs to happen at the platform level. What are the standards to ensure interoperability? You and I spoke about this before. Who are the issuers of this credential? What are the mechanisms in which consumers or an individual or entity can store and save and access and control what it is that they're given the right to do so? And those are, each one of those are a multitude of issues that we're going to have to uncover. And this gets to my belief that to tackle this problem, it's going to be about collaboration and unification, and it will be about unification of some unexpected brands and entities coming together that you may not have imagined. And COVID was a forcing function for that. We saw Google and Apple, playing together that I don't think any of us would have expected. You're seeing government institutions in EMEA who are coming together to figure out what does a portable ID look like. You're seeing public and private sectors, and the combination of that and the facilitation of that and some sort of open standards is what's going to drive us forward. But we have to move in that direction. And I think, unfortunately, there are some affiliations that have been created to do this, but sometimes the affiliations don't move to the operational element of getting this done. And I think that's where the balancing act is going to lie.
Do you worry about the risk of getting the source of truth wrong? Because fraudsters are very creative. They have the same tools that we have. We've talked about that too. But if everything that is done is based on, the source of truth, using that to create the identity, verify that identity, validate that identity, authenticate that identity.
I do.
That gets right. How do we make sure that part of it is right?
I think there's the question of how right can you be all the time? And I think we would all love to believe that you can be right 100% of the time, and there are no false positives and are no false negatives. But the reality is that's not a reality, and that there will be inconsistencies and there will be mistakes. And particularly when you're looking at technology and you're looking at new ways of assessing who people are. One of the reasons why I joined Authentics, and I normally don't speak about the company in some of these discussions, is because I believe that at this point in our time in society, that an ID that's government issued is kind of the anchor of trust. It's the starting point. And yes, I also believe that over time, and we're seeing it now, IDs that are issued from government institutions or authoritative parties will be issued digitally. But in either case, if it's digital or physical, it's that anchor, and it's that anchor you can build upon. And so, in our field, we're always looking at how do you minimize the false positive and the false negatives, and how do you fine tune the tolerance based on the problem that you're trying to solve. But then equally, Karen, it's about what's the safety net behind when there may be a mistake, because to your point, to say, let's just take it back to this individual, this employee of mine, that the institution took away that he isn't who he is, or he's not making the right salary in order to have that loan accessible to him. That has implications on where he lives, on who he lives with, and that just has cascading implications. And so I do worry about that. And our job is to minimize it by recognizing you have to have some sort of checks and balances, because technology is imperfect and life is imperfect. And so we got to accept that.
I have a funny feeling we'll be talking about this for a long time to come, but we'll be talking about the progress we're making. It's certainly a problem everyone knows is a problem in need of a solution. I think the challenge is what we talked about, making it a solution that is practical and realistic for the consumer and the other relying party, whoever that may be. And there are a lot of complicated legal, social, regulatory issues, the technology issues that all come into play when deciding the path forward.
Yeah, and I'll leave you with this. Someone said to me the other day that this used to be a nice to have. It's no longer a nice to have.
Sure.
It's a must have.
Sure.
And getting it right as you can is also a must have. And so we just have to embrace it and find the right way forward.
Sounds like a plan. Well, thank you, Carrie. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Karen. Thank you.